Hi, so I personally like trigger warnings, and while I don't expect them from anyone online, I do always appreciate it when I see someone using them. I remember one time being asked when they should be used, and when it comes to places like YouTube, I take the position of do whatever you want, although, again, it is appreciated when people are considerate enough to use them. If someone's content is too triggering for me, I just don't subscribe and have even unsubbed to people in the past just based on titles and thumbnails and not wanting to see it in my subscription feed. Luckily, not a regular issue, but yeah, I guess a lot of it really just depends on who you want as an audience and how much one cares about including certain people in their audience. For me personally, I usually skip adding a trigger warning if the content is obvious based on the title alone. Like, if rape is in the title, then I don't think a warning is needed unless it's more detailed or graphic than normal. Then I'll add one to show that distinction. I often don't even think about including warnings for other content, and I'm guessing most people don't either, which I can understand. But if I remember a subscriber talking about how they would like trigger warnings for certain topics, then I'll try to remember to use them, and not just because if one person suggests it, there's potentially many more who would also find it triggering, but because even if it's just that one person alone, I'd feel like a bit of an asshole if I didn't. Takes 2 seconds, doesn't harm anyone, and can potentially help them. So basically, I just encourage people to do the best they can if they decide to use them at all, which I do encourage. When it comes to education, then I do think it's more important because I think education should be as accessible as possible, and trigger warnings can help a lot with that. A lot of people against using trigger warnings tend to portray it as coddling people who are just too sensitive, as if being triggered is only becoming temporarily sad and it's something they can or should be able to get over easily. But being triggered can come with panic attacks, flashbacks, and dissociation, and these things can seriously fuck up your day and make learning impossible. Even basic shit can be difficult when you can barely even focus on your own breathing. So, trigger warnings and trying to work with someone instead of ignoring their needs can potentially prevent lowered grades or even people dropping out of school. One common argument I've seen against using trigger warnings is the belief that it would interfere with them getting better because exposure is often used in therapy for PTSD and avoidance could potentially make their symptoms worse. But while trigger warnings can sometimes be used purely for avoidance, they're more typically used as a way to control when they decide to take on something that could be triggering in an attempt to limit symptoms or make those symptoms easier to deal with that doesn't interfere with work, school, or whatever else. And I think it's weird that people seem to treat all exposure the same when exposure in therapy is a lot different than exposure at random during everyday life. If it wasn't different at all, then people probably wouldn't need therapy because they would get better over time simply for existing, as it's nearly impossible to avoid all triggers. Exposure also isn't necessary to treat PTSD. It is common. But for example, there's interpersonal psychotherapy that seems to work just as well as therapy focused on exposure, and for some would work much better. And I also think it's weird when people think schools shouldn't work with people who have PTSD because those people should go to therapy instead. But even if therapy is successful, it doesn't work immediately. So there would still be a period of time when warnings could make a big difference. But yeah, I really don't understand why some people seem so resistant to warnings and seem to hate them. Indifference, I could probably understand, but actual dislike just seems silly to me. I guess maybe one could dislike them if they fear moral judgments for not using warnings themselves. But often it seems like people just hate them because of its association with feminism and nothing else. Or I don't know, maybe people just get uncomfortable because it reminds them of the prevalence of sexual violence, and a lot of people prefer not to think about it. Curious what other people think. That's it for from me for now. So, bye.